Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you here this evening. Apparently there was a game on somewhere. So, who won? There you go. Anyway, so I'm delighted to welcome you to this special edition of Galway International Arts Festival, Vinyl Hours. I'm Tiernan Henry, as Jack said. And we usually talk about songs and music on the show, but tonight it's slightly different. We're talking about the thing that the songs come wrapped up in. The 12-inch cardboard squares, the CD inserts, and the stamp-size images on our phones and our tablets. It's the sleeve. It's as important as the thing inside it, and it might be the thing that draws you to it first as well. And for my generation, certainly, the sleeve is a tactile connection and a gateway to other universes. So we're here to talk about this with someone whose career has been framed by and has framed the sleeve. He was a teenage DJ in a club called Middle Earth, and he founded a fanzine called Freep in the late 60s. And he talked his way backstage in the National Stadium in 1971 and sat behind John Bonham's drum kit. He founded the Radiators from Outer Space before switching to design, working for an up-and-coming North Dublin four-piece band. He's had a decades-long association with U2 and a host of other bands and artists. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steve Averill.
Thank you. Well, what we're going to try and do today is go look at some of these sleeves that I've chosen and give you a bit of background information into them and how they create. Every sleeve that I've done has a story, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, about how it actually came to be what it is there. Here was mentioned there about sleeves. There are some stories about sleeves that are legendary. There's a band called The Motors who had an album cover, and they had 3 hits, including the song Airport. They released the album, and the record company found that their album wasn't selling, and they couldn't figure out why it wasn't selling. There was a picture of the band on the front, and the market research came back and said, the band's too ugly. We don't like to buy it. So they switched the cover, and then the cover now has a windscreen on it, and it hit the top 20. So what I've learned from that is that sleeves are important, that people will respond. And as you say, when I was a teenager, you'd go to the racks, and something would attract you in the cover, and you'd take it out and you'd look at it and you'd say, "Oh, this could be good," and you'd want to take it home and listen to it and see if the music related to the cover. Yeah. But it works both ways. It works in the way that you can design a cover for the music that's not particularly good, and that's very hard to get over. Or you can design listen to a great band and listen to the music and feel that the cover is not quite representing what's there. Now, my whole career was in Irish music to a large degree. I have worked with international artists like Depeche Mode and Elvis Costello and others, but because I decided, when I came back from England, I went to England for a summer after doing the leaving, and I wanted to get into graphic design. Probably from the age of about 12, that people asked me what I wanted to do. I said what was known in those days as commercial art. It wasn't considered to be fine art. I even went to the National College of Art, and they turned me away and said, "We don't do that kind of stuff. We do fine art and sculpture, but not the kind of thing you're doing." So there was nowhere for me to actually go and learn what the trade that I wanted to do. So I started working in a printers, which was absolutely abysmal. Had nothing to do with design at all. So when I was part of that, working in a print firm, a couple of the guys who were doing a course in Bolton Street in print technology, and they said to me, "You should come in and meet this guy that's giving us a lecture. He's totally off his head. He'd suit you completely." So I went in. I wasn't signed up for the course. I went in and met the guy that was teaching, who was a guy called Phil Walsh, and he became my mentor and got me my first job in advertising, which was quite difficult to get into the foot in the door. So that's where I started in design. And then I worked and did my first sleeve in an advertising agency for a charity record. And then slowly, as I began to establish myself as an art director and designer, I decided to set up an individual design consultancy specifically for music and entertainment work. Now, at this stage, I had already started to work with a fledgling North Dublin band who became known as U2. So I was trying to do work for them at night times between doing my daily job They didn't particularly appreciate the band arriving in the reception area, trying to calm me down to ask me questions about various things. But that was where my passion lay. I love designing pretty well anything, but the combination of music and graphics is what I've been very much about. So we'll go to the first slide, and this was at 12 years old. I began to notice the difference between what was probably a cheap publicity shot on an album cover and a shot that was deliberately taken for an album cover. This was taken by a photographer called Robert Freeman, who was a friend of John Lennon's at the time. It was shot in a hotel, I believe, in Brighton. He shot it in the dining room, and he opened the curtain on one side of the room, and there was black curtains behind it. So the light comes across in one way. And that was the first time I really noticed there's something special about this photography. And I began to see it emerging in other areas of graphic art in the music industry, that there was people getting involved who were, like the music, exploring and doing individual things to make it work.
Because I read about this one, and they really hated the sleeve of the first album.
They did.
But they had no input in it.
No.
And then they said, we want our sleeve.
To be controlled.
The
first one was
no one had ever done that
looking
before.
over the balcony. Which was kind of like a quick 5-minute shot.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked with a well-known artist, Irish artist, one time, and I did an album cover with her, with an Irish photographer, and she said, "God, this is so different." She said, my first album cover, I'd come off the stage, I was covered in sweat, I sat in a chair, the photographer walked in, and he said, I got 3 shots on the end of my roll and walked off and took shots. So that was my album.
That was the cover.
I had no say whatsoever in what was picked for it. So you find that the artists begin to take control of what their image is.
Because even with this one, when it was released in Australia, whether it was, I don't know, it was Parlophone in Australia, whoever had they didn't have the art, so they did their own art for it.
Yeah.
So even, and I think, how quickly you think this shifted. So this was the end of 1963. Yes. And not 3 years later, we're at Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah.
No, the cover,
was changing,
and the control had shifted completely. And you even think just that...
Yeah, well, Brian Epstein hated this.
Yeah.
He said, you guys are cheery, happy people. Where's this glum picture coming from? He wanted to change it completely, but they insisted, no, this is the cover, and it is a classic. Yeah. And that photograph has been reproduced by many other bands in different guises. Of course, But then I thought, okay, rock and roll, maybe I can be a rock star, and you see, I thought I could be a part of this. I could be a part of the whole thing. I could really, and then I discovered I couldn't play an instrument and I couldn't sing. So I thought, okay, this is going to stymie my musical career. Where am I going to go with this? And then I worked away doing what I was doing. Then in 1975, 76, I decided, okay, I'll form my own band. Therefore, they can't fire me because I can't sing. So I decided to form a band called The Radiators from Space. And we worked with Eamon Carr from Horselips. He produced a demo for us. I was working at the time as a Saturday job in Golden Discs store in Liffey Street. And I said, okay, I'll keep an eye on people coming into the shop. If I see somebody who comes in who looks great, he looks like a rock star, I'll ask him, does he want to join a band? I'd never ask, could they play or could they do anything?
Do you want to be in a band?
As people came in, I'd watch what records in the rack they were looking, and if they took out Roxy Music or David Bowie, or I said, okay, I'll ask this guy. And that's how the first 2 members of the band, Pete Holiday and Billy Morley, were found. And then we spent literally a year and a half trying to find a bass and drummer that fitted, that didn't say the moment we'd go and meet them in a pub, we'd explain the kind of music we love, the MC5, the New York Dolls, and all that. And they come to rehearsal and they say, can we play Deep Purple? There's the door. So eventually, Billy quit because he got so fed up with it, and then Philip Chevron joined. And through Philip, we got Jimmy Crash and Mark Megaray. But the demo that we did in a small demo studio in Dublin was picked up by Eamon Carr and taken across to London, where he took it to friends of his who worked in a record shop called Rock On, who had a small little label called Chiswick Records. The word came back from them to accompany the package. I sat down and designed a little 7-inch single, a mock-up of that, and said this is what the cover would look like. So the word came back from the record company was, we didn't think an awful lot of the demo, but we love the cover. So we're going to come to Dublin and try and re-record the tracks to match up
the cover is.
And this was the cover.
Yeah.
So I took all the photographs, including the one of myself on the cover, and I just really kind of thought the lettering was done in a couple of days. It was supposed to represent something of a blitzkrieg, of sort of punk feeling to the whole thing. We didn't call ourselves a punk band. We started. We called ourselves High Energy Suburban Rock and Roll, and that's what we tried to say.
Very specific. It's a very specific locale there. High Energy Suburban.
Yeah, exactly. Because we came from the we were rehearsing in the garage in Portmarnock. Yeah. That's where we kind of homed it.
And literally, was this cut and paste? When you put this together, how did you, I mean, it's a stupid technical question, but how did you do the lettering? Is that hand done?
That's all hand done.
Yeah.
I just simply started to do the first letter and then moved the letters across and got some letters and cut it in half and then just decided to draw the whole thing completely. Now, I have for donkey's years been asked by various people, would I actually complete the alphabet?
Right.
To do it. And finally last year I did. I completed a Radio's alphabet, so I have the entire alphabet to be used. But it became iconic. I only used it the once, and I only intended to use it the once. But then it went onto a T-shirt, and throughout our career, people have come along. When we've done it, we did an album for a Japanese label. At the very end of the last slide we'll see is 4 album covers that I did for a particular album. And we did, a Japanese company licensed the album. And we sent the artwork to them, and a guy rang up and says, no, zigzag lettering, you know. So I used it again, and I've used it every now and then to go back to it. And my current band, which is an offshoot of the Radiators, is called Troubled Pilgrims. So we actually did a Troubled Pilgrims logo in the same lettering. But it just shows you that you can have an impact with typography. You can actually make something really, and it suited the whole zeitgeist of punk. It looks like a blitzkrieg kind of lettering. Now, on the negative side of it, it's probably had its roots in the SS symbol, because people were using Nazi symbols in early punk. And we kind of railed against it, so we said, let's try and create something different. But we were trying to get across the mode of what that energy was. And that's really where it came from.
And then, did this get you other work?
You see, I was actually already working. I was working in an advertising agency at that point.
But did other bands come talk to you after this?
Yeah, there's some young band that came along and said, their bass player by the name of Adam Clayton said, he was in the same class as my younger brother. And he said, this guy at work keeps pestering me, or at school, keeps pestering me about talking to you about being a rock star in the radios, and me a rock star. Okay, then tell him he's welcome to come over. And Adam spent a lot of time coming over to the house and talking about music in general and about how they could get a foothold in the industry and how they could possibly achieve something. At that stage, they were known as the Hype. Yeah. And we talked about the Hype was not a particularly positive word for music in the music industry at that point. It was associated with buying your way into the charts and getting hit singles and things like that. So I just said, okay, come over and talk, and we did. And then after maybe 6 months, 9 months of talking and things like that, he said, well, we're playing at a talent contest in Limerick, and I'd like to have a new name for the band. And he said, my brief is I want a name like Ecstasy. Yeah. So I went away for a couple of weeks, thought about it, and said, well, I'm aware of the Gary Powers spy plane, the U2. I'm aware that there's a suburban stop on the Berlin Underground called the U2. I'm aware of a U-boat called U2. I'm aware of the Everready battery, which was a standard battery in those days, was the Everready U2. I'm aware that my tape deck is called the U2. And I'm very aware that people say, have a good day, and they say U2. Yeah. So, and perhaps the biggest thing in my mind was, if you have a poster and your name is U2, it's going to be big. If you're called, some long name, it's going to be small and the whole thing. So, and it also, which I didn't quite think about at the time, but it's international. Every country in the world, it's one letter and one numeral. Yeah. So it's you don't have to translate it or do anything with it. So they went down to Limerick. Bono didn't like the name, still doesn't like the name, still doesn't understand why I chose the name. But anyway, that's in his book. And I've spoken to him about it since and said, well, I'm quite happy to take that name back if you like. I could use it. And they won the competition in Limerick and they became U2. And that's how it went with that.
And then, how well, I know that you did the Boy album cover, or that you designed that.
Yes.
So how did you get from, say, this space here to, being, I suppose, in a way, North Dublin must have been a tiny village in a way.
Well,
Adam village
Clayton
of you,
and the Edge
yeah,
lived in Malahide,
yeah,
which is where I lived,
yeah,
until I moved to Portmarnock.
yeah,
So I knew them. I knew them to see. I didn't know who they were. My parents knew their parents and so on. So there was that kind of introduction. And gradually, I think the trust was built up.
yeah.
And I did their first poster. I did the U2 single cover. And I said, I don't mind getting involved in these kind of things, but I would really like to be able to do the first album cover, if you can let me do that. Yeah. And to be fair to them, they did. They let me do the first album cover with a lot of resistance from the record company. Record company didn't understand why they wanted to work with a kind of what they said was a kid from Dublin, whereas they could have their renowned record department do the cover. And in fact, the Boy album cover was changed for the American market. Yeah. And I had no knowledge of that until I found out later on that it had been changed. And I was a bit pissed off with that because, if they'd wanted to change it, I felt that they could have done. But this, again, was the record company's art department ignoring me and saying, well, we'll do it and we'll prove we can get a better cover than what you've done. But that cover became iconic.
Yeah, I suppose we can
go on to it. Yeah. This cover became iconic, and it also was quite an adventurous step because, as you can see, there's no title on the album cover, and the U2 is in the hair and the boy, so it isn't immediate. But when I was talking to the band about this, they gave me the contact sheets taken by a photographer called Hugo McGuinness, who's actually no relation to Paul's, but and I looked at it, and within, I would say, 20 minutes, I said, that's the cover. Yeah. It has to be. It reflects the naivety of and the innocence that you're talking about in your songs and doing that. This really has to be the record cover. And they fought hard for it because the record company was trying to say, it's this. And then suddenly people started requesting the picture to buy. Could they buy the picture as an art print and things like that? And I suppose I only realised its deep significance when the RHI, the Royal Herbarian Institute, published a book about art in Ireland, fine art, basically sculpture and paintings. And this is the only piece of graphics that's featured in the book as Irish graphic design at the time. And it really hit me then that this actually is quite an adventurous piece of work.
So when you saw that first contact sheet and you said, that's it, were you immediately sure that was it, in terms of no lettering, nothing else, just the strength of the image?
I absolutely was drawn to the picture. I think that Peter Rowan, who's the boy there, is now a photographer himself. Yeah. But I thought his eyes were incredible. Yeah. I just thought, this is looking at you. You pick that up in a record shop. It's staring at you. Yeah. And you kind of want to know more about what the songs and what the band are about from that. So, and then the second album cover, October, became almost what a first album should be. It was a picture of the band. The band together. And done that way. But it helped my career because it actually won several awards. Yeah. And that really made people a little bit more aware of my work. And then there was sort of a request maybe to travel to London to work there because there's a lot more record companies over there. But I always felt, as did you too, that every band, which was the normal path for any band in Ireland, if they got any success, you moved to London.
You went to London, yeah.
And likewise, there was pretty well, the only other person I knew that was a graphic designer, or in fact, in his case, an illustrator who was living in Ireland was Jim Fitzpatrick. And I knew Jim quite well. And I said, look, I've made this decision to stay in Ireland. And then slowly that industry began to, and the fact that U2 had their offices in Dublin made a huge big difference because they began to develop a staging company and people who were professional at sound and the whole thing. So the industry began really to take off in Dublin.
So even though you were starting to pick up work, and as they grew, you were, I would guess, you were still involved with them.
Yes.
But you did still retain that, as you said, that connection to Ireland, because, you still worked with other Irish bands.
Oh, absolutely.
Not necessarily established Irish bands.
To this day, I still like to work with upcoming Irish bands to sort of try and work together. Now, the interesting thing was, for me, all my heroes, people like Vaughan Oliver, who did the 4 AD sleeves, developed a completely unique graphic style and photographic style that he used for pretty well all his covers.
Yeah.
To the point where bands like the Pixies said we no longer want him to design our covers because people notice the covers more than they notice the music. In my case, because I was in Ireland, in Dublin, all the bands that came to me, like after the U2, there was the Virgin Prunes and other bands, they said, we really love your work, but we don't want to look anything like U2. So what you have to do as a designer is say, what is really important here is the band's identity, not my identity. So I began to adapt my work so that it suited what the artist was about, trying to find... I always felt that when I pick up a sleeve, I want that sleeve to inform me a little about what the music is, but not in a typographical, graphic way that is simply about trends.
Yeah.
Because if you go back and say, look at an album by a band like Culture Club, it's rooted in a specific time and era. I would like people to, if they pick that up today, would feel it's a strong cover today, as it was back.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's tied to 1980 or
absolutely.
Whatever.
You try and avoid those typographical cliches and just simply try and create something that's new. Now, it didn't always work. I mean, the problem about it was, for me, was I started to work for an awful lot of record companies, and I felt that everybody deserves a good cover, no matter who they are. And in fact, some of the better covers, or more interesting covers I did, were for people, like I did an album cover for Joe Dolan. And Joe was great. He said, look, you're a professional and you tell me what you want. Whereas with the rock bands, they were telling you what colour it should be and what the typography should be and the whole thing. And I kind of eventually, in some cases, said, look, guys, that's that catalogue. You should go and do it yourselves because you're not actually asking me to do anything creative. You're just simply asking me to do what is. And there are stories, and we'll move on anyway to some of the other covers so we can talk about those. This was the Virgin Prunes. And they were, as you know, great mates of U2, and so the two would work very closely together. Not so much, the Prunes would often support U2 on gigs, and to Paul McGuinness's annoyance, would often make the audience leave before U2 came on, because they were very confrontational as a band, and probably, in reality, more punk than most punk bands would ever be. This cover was photographed by a wonderful fashion photographer I had worked with called Ursula Steiger. And when we began to sort of talk about what we would do for a cover, I thought, let's talk to Ursula, because she's a German-born photographer who is a little bit more interested in experimenting with what we're doing. So they had a rehearsal studio. This was a house in Temple Bar, or an old building in Temple Bar that they used to rehearse in, that was pretty much run down. And we had discussed the idea of fire, as because the back cover, which is also a double front cover, is about earth. So this is about fire, and the blue is a little bit about water. But in fact, the blue behind is part of the wall of the building, which was falling apart and decaying. So I arrived at the studio, and they started to light fires in the studio, which was disastrous because it was full of smoke that you couldn't see anything, and it was dangerous. So I kind of said, look, let's put that to one side. Let's think about how we expose the fire. So I said, what if you had a piece of burning wood that you used like a samurai sword, and you just did the thing? So that's what he was doing there. He was doing this on the knee like a samurai bend. And she shot it on a long exposure so that the fire would move across, and the heads are beginning to blur. And I think it's a powerful shot. I think it really sums up the adventurous and the edginess that the Prunes had at that time.
So when you were doing this, when you were working with them, as you mentioned Ursula, was it your idea to bring Ursula in? When you're working with a band like this, do you largely have total creative freedom? Or,
unless there's a specific request, but in most cases they would say, who do you think we should use as a photographer? And I would always try to match the idea with the photographer. Now, and because I was at that time still working in the advertising industry, I worked with a lot of photographers on fashion shoots and things like that. So I began to know which ones were more interesting. And another thing that I always used to do as well, and again, over the next adventure in the 12 Adventures of Sleeve, I'll show some of those. I used to say to photographers, listen, if you've got any outtakes that you've taken for yourself or for anybody else that you think are weird and wonderful, give them to me. And I used to have a tin box full of outtakes that photographers had given me of end of reels or something they just shot with the whole thing with abstract imagery. And occasionally when a band came in and they didn't really know what they wanted, I said, well, sit there for an hour and go through that box and see if anything strikes you. And sometimes they picked a picture which I wouldn't have chosen, But when I saw it, it was absolutely perfect for what they wanted to do with it. It was more abstract imagery, and it created immediately an identity. And again, later on, some of the covers I did even with artists like Elvis Costello. He would say to me, "You've come down to the studio." He'd play me most of the album to listen to, and he'd say, "Can you go away and see if you can find something that fits with what you're doing?" And I would try and do that. In the same way that if you look at the Smiths' work, none of the Smiths' covers, singles and albums for the first until the greatest hits ever had a picture of the band on it. It was always imagery that Morrissey had chosen that he felt summed up the song, and I think that's great as well. And the other thing that happens quite a lot is the Motorhead route, which I call it, or Chicago route, where every album cover has the same logo on it, but treated in a different way each time. They're both valid avenues to explore.
And I suppose then, because as we look at the next one as well, it changes again, as you think. It reflects.
Yeah. This was a photographer who I really admired and really wanted to work with a great deal. Unfortunately, I only ever got to do the one sleeve with him, and he died end of last year, and that's Brian Griffin, who was a magical photographer. He photographed the Echo and the Bunnymen sleeves and the various early Depeche Mode, the famous one of the person doing the Construction Time Again album covers. And Brian was Cactus World News sat down and said, "We'd like something that's surrealistic in its approach." And I said, "Well, I know the guy that could get that for us." And at that stage, they were signed to a major label. Their first single, an EP, was on U2's Mother Records label, and I designed that as well. But here we had a budget from a bigger company, and we were trying to do something. And Brian came to Dublin. This was shot on Howth Head, and we just found this corner where there had been a concrete pole that was part of a fencing situation. And Brian, I'd never seen it done before. He had 12 flashes that go in the ground, and they're clicked by the camera with an automatic flashlight. So he would fire these off in full daylight, but they would create a totally weird lighting situation. And that's Wayne, the band's drummer. And he said, "Well, we'll try Wayne against the pillar and do it that way." And that was an abstract piece of material that I photographed that sort of matched in with the edges of the frame. And the Urban Beaches was hand drawn, and the Cactus World News lettering was an old typeface I found in a type catalogue.
So this was like mid-80s. So was this still cut and paste at this stage, or were you sort of moving into...
No. The very first album cover that we did on a computer was U2's Zoo album. Even the Acton Baby was done as bench artwork.
Right, yeah.
So to anyone who doesn't know, the bench artwork was you sat down with a large piece of board, you sat and ruled out the 12 inches square and with all the cut marks and where it should be, and then you did tracing paper overlays where the photograph was going to be and where everything else was going to be. And in those days, it was kind of magic to a lot of people because they couldn't understand how you got from this black and white piece of board with a few trace overlays with marks saying, this colour here, this colour here, and the whole thing became a sleeve. Yeah. But we would get, for the major label stuff, you would eventually get a proof from the printer, which would show you what they call progressive proofs. It would show you the yellow and magenta, and so on until you had the full four-colour sleeve. Yeah. So that was probably the first time you looked at it and you said, well, that's not going to work because the colour you might have picked didn't work against the background, the colour that was there. So you might get a chance to change it, or quite often you might not get a chance to change it depending on the budget that was available.
So it's entirely organic. It was
absolutely
entirely organic process.
And as I say, even with commercial work, with advertising work, the clients didn't know how you got there. Yeah. When the computers came in, more and more. I mean, I could show you mock-ups of U2 album covers where the typography, where the track listing was. It's just a piece of gold marker going. That's where the titles go. Yeah. And people saw it and they said, "Oh yeah, that's great. That's fine. Let's go to the artwork stage and do it that way." But more and more as the computer came in, they wanted to see the final cover with everything in position, everything, and they'd say, "Can you move that down?" And it became less interesting in some ways, but more concise. The advantages of the computer were. If you ever had to do a lyric sheet to go with an album, normally what happened is you'd spend 2 or 3 days laying it out so that everything was perfectly aligned, and somebody would ring up and say, "Oh, they've written an extra verse for that song," and basically everything was stuck down with cow gum onto the board.
Yeah.
So you literally had to take every line up again and relay the whole thing out again. Whereas with the computer, you could say, okay, shift that over and we'll do it that way. But you still had to align everything in a way that's kind of fairly perfect. But I love the old way. And more on my steveaverill.com website, there's samples of proofs and things like that. And you can see how it used to work in the old days and do it that way. But as I say, when we got to the album after Acton Baby with the Zoo, we decided to use we bought our first computer, and strangely enough, that first computer, which was about the memory of a phone, a bad old phone, cost us more money than a contemporary computer would. But we knew we had to get into computers. We knew it was part of the way the world was developing, and we do it. And for me, I'd spent 20 years learning how to do things as on a bench art, by getting a camera in the dark room, getting the right kind of lettering and kind of thing we'd done. So suddenly you had to relearn your whole thinking, even though the process was still important in your head because you knew the steps you were taking, but you were doing it on a computer as opposed to on bench artwork.
And then still, like some of the stuff that you were doing were still relatively straightforward as well. I suppose working with the bands again. I suppose your next one is an example of that, you know?
Yeah. This was the Aslan's first album. There was two versions of this cover done. This one I think was I'm not sure why there was two versions. I've forgotten right now, but I think one might have been UK, one might have been the Irish version of it. I had long conversations with Christy about the cover. He had the title. He wanted to call the album Feel No Shame. Yeah. And I said, well, look, what is probably a very striking image is you're considered a fingerless hard man with the tattoo and the whole thing, and your music is very raw. What's more tender in many ways and with no shame is cuddling your child with the whole thing. So that's what that picture became. It was Amelia Steen was the photographer, and we actually did a whole roll of film with Kira in his arms, and some of them are funny because she's just trying to wriggle out of his arms and he's trying to hold on to her and do the whole thing. But I said it's more interesting when you turn your head away than it is when you actually can see your face, because the face is, in a sense, not unlike the face on the boy cover, is making contact, but the contact here is quite different. It's quite a different emotion has been expressed than the one in the innocence of the boy cover.
Yeah, or even war. And again, I suppose, well, if the two of them were looking this way, it would split. You wouldn't know which one to look at. But it's really clear you're just drawn straight to the eyes.
And the way the photograph was, the light just simply hit her in the face. And I think leaning against the tattoo, the Aslan, the lion tattoo, is just summed it up. And I went home at the weekend and I drew the Aslan logo.
That's what I was going to ask you about that. Was that them, or because that is their logo?
Yeah, they didn't know. They just said, we'd like a logo.
Aslan,
and everybody in the band kind of said, can you do a logo? Yeah. And I went home and I did it by hand and brought it in, and they loved it. So much so that they've used it every single release. And I said, that's great, boys, it's a complimentary, but could you ever credit me occasionally that it's the same logo that I designed for you? And then unfortunately, when Christy passed away, as you know, I did a version of it that said Slán Abhaile. I just take the word Slán and put the Abhaile there, because, and as far as I know, the band are still using it as a logo,
And I suppose it's instantly recognisable.
Exactly. I mean, it's a bit like what we were talking about the Motorhead logo or the Chicago logo. It's become they feel that they moved away from it. People would lose the identity. We did at one point, at Christie's behest, try something new. I did a new hand drawn logo, which I thought would be just to show people they were moving in a different direction. But they decided that they stick with what they had at the time.
And I suppose, again, just because this is this is the end of the 80s, and you're still working with new bands even going into the 90s. Yeah. But there's a different aesthetic on some of the other stuff then that you start doing there.
Well, you have to, because as you listen to the music and as you understand the music, I mean, Aslan's sort of strong rock background, but also with the energy that they were putting in and the emotion they were putting into it, required that kind of strength. Whereas when you're talking maybe somebody who's a little bit more widescreen, you need something a little bit different to get that across.
I suppose that's like this one,
This was Something Happens. This is one of those stories whereby Tom Dunn came in to me and said, we don't want a picture I think they'd done an EP with the band picture on
Right.
it. I said, we don't want to go that way anymore.
Yeah.
We want something that expresses the emotion a little bit differently.
Yeah.
I didn't know where to go. I mean, the titles, how do you sum up that title, being there, seeing that, done that? And I couldn't. Immediately, and in those days, we used to have an awful lot of photographic library catalogues and also
Yeah.
photo annuals. And I went through one of the annuals I had, and this picture was taken by a guy called Olaf Nielsen, and it's called Skyrockets. And I just thought, it's kind of summed up the emotion of movement and the whole thing. So I brought it to the band, and Tom loved it. He said, he's told me not so long ago that it's still his favourite album cover.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to have the band's name fit in, so that became sort of a see-through lettering that showed the background through it, and the title is pretty strong there.
I always thought it was this shirt.
Oh,
Because
it
the
Yeah, it
floral
could have
shirt.
been
That's
a
when
Hawaiian
I
shirt.
got it. I just presumed that's
Yeah,
what it was,
it's just
you know.
simply
Yeah,
lilies lying down
yeah,
on flowers that are lying down and
yeah.
the whole thing. And the other thing that you learn as well is that if you license a photograph, and I don't think they did this properly, but if you license a photograph, your license lasts for a period of time.
Right.
And then if the record company re-releases the album 20 years later, they have to go back and relicense the image. And a lot of people didn't realize. They thought, oh, I bought the picture. But you don't. You buy the license for the use of that image on that particular purpose only.
Yeah.
Now, Olaf Nielsen could sell this as a print quite legitimately. I did a cover later for Elvis Costello, and with the legal department of Warner's, we made sure that it was an indefinite license. But the artist who took the picture could use it herself in any context. She wanted to do it, but as an album cover, that was the rights were bought for that.
And because I was looking at this at home today earlier, and did you do the lyric sheet as well?
Yes.
Because again, there's design in that.
Yes.
You know.
See, sometimes, as you say, and if I did it properly, you might say this is my life in 300 album covers.
Yeah.
Because most album covers aren't just the front.
Yeah.
They're the back,
They're the back,
the inside, the labels,
exactly.
all that is
Everything,
part of the overall context of the sleeve as well.
Yeah. And then I suppose, because I think that what you're showing here is that it's a history of Irish rock. I know it's one particular version of it, and as you say, you can change any version of it. But all of these are really they're really important albums in an Irish context, and you know, either for the bands themselves or where Ireland was at the time or what was happening.
Absolutely, and I was very conscious of that. And I say these largely are sleeves from rock bands, but I mean, I did everybody. I did the Dubliners. I did, as I said, my role was Rolly Daniel. I did a load of show band sleeves. You know, Sandy Kelly and people like that. You know, I didn't think, and I would always try to employ a photographer who was like Amelia or Conor Horgan. People who were a really good photographer. I didn't say this is a throwaway thing. It's not my bag. I can't do this. You just simply tried to bring your very best game to all the covers that you did. And Vinny asked me early on how many sleeves I'd done, and I'm not sure, but somebody said to me recently that I think you've done about 500 album covers. But that's, mind you, that's a 50-year period, so probably not a huge amount. But that includes singles, you know, album covers, and then when we moved to CD covers and things like that. But and that's probably something that has been asked to me for a long time. What did you think of the change from vinyl to CD? And it didn't. I love vinyl. And I was a vinyl collector for a long, long time. But in fact, I didn't really object to the moving down the size of CD, because when the CD first came out, we were given a lot more license. We were given enough, 20 pages of booklet. So that allowed you to expand your design process into 20 pages of booklet, or in the case of one of the U2 albums, 36 pages of design. These days, CDs are basically just a front and back cover and very little else. And that's a shame, because you were also able to explore cardboard cutting, you were able to do fold-out covers and things like that. So I think the CD was interesting and was exciting, but now we're back to vinyl to a large degree. The problem now is the record industry killed the vinyl. I mean, Island Records told me at the time they were pressing their albums on the most shittiest vinyl they could get, so it would force people to move to CD. And eventually, you couldn't buy the vinyl version anyway, so you were forced to CD. And now people are telling you that CDs are dead. And that's not what I'm being told by the artists. The artists said their sales are pretty much 50-50 between vinyl and CD. And the other factor that's happened with my band as well is you order the CD, you order the vinyl together for a release date together, and you're continually being told by the pressing plant, oh, it's delayed, because they would get an order from a major company for 10,000 record store day vinyl. So yours is put back because you're doing 300 or 500 vinyl copies. So it was 9 months after we ordered it that we got the vinyl version of it. And that kills your sales and also infuriates the fans because you're saying we're going to have these on the same day.
And here's the release date.
And I'm still hearing that. I'm still hearing that from bands saying, oh, I'm getting an awful lot of stick from the fans because the vinyl, they think I'm trying to rip them off because I don't have the vinyl version of it. And it's not. It's simply the capacity for printing vinyl is not that big. It hasn't really grown a great deal. So, and most of it's in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed as well about new vinyl, the difference between now and, say, in the 70s and 80s, as you said, when you go into a record shop in the 70s, when you went to Freebird, it was the sleeve.
Yeah.
That's what you were flicking through.
Yeah.
So everything was bendable, so you could get through more. And now the record is in the sleeve. And you end up having to pull out a pile just, or you give up on it.
But take some up so you can see. And even
just
then,
so that you can
it's
see
sealed,
them. Yeah,
so you have no more,
because,
information than the cover and the back of it.
And as a teenager, I certainly remember, before I could afford too many records, you just go in and look at them.
Yeah.
And you're going, what does this sound like?
Well, I mean, it was the only case in my life that I had to go ex-directory after a while because suddenly my name was in the phone book, and at 4 a.m, some drunken American said, "Hey man, I'm looking at your cover here. Oh, it's really great, man." And that just drove my wife crazy because when you get a phone call at 4 a.m, you think something negative has happened in the family. To be told, I love your sleeve. I know why you did that cover. Especially Acton Baby. No, thank you very much.
I think it's on this one that maybe it's this or one of the albums that you have up. Because I was looking at it again today, they have the address of their manager. Please contact. And MCD's then address. Out in Killiney. And so there's 3 actual physical addresses given where you can, and they're obviously just houses.
Of course. Because the guy I can't remember who was managing somebody happens at that stage, but yes, he wanted everybody to know where to get in touch with the band so they could get gigs. So suddenly your name, and of course once mobile phones came in, everybody's got that. So the sensible people would have one phone for business and one phone for personal calls. I stupidly didn't do that.
I suppose we can go on because your next one as well is this one,
This is an Emotional Fish. This is their first album cover, and this one drove me bonkers. I was asked to go to London and complete the artwork in the offices of East West Records, which are a part of WA. And we had designed a cover that was not this cover completely, and I'm trying to get the original print back. A photographer called Harry Thulier took this beautiful picture, which is very 4AD-ish. It's a kind of a picture of a nude woman sitting in a room holding a big piece of metal in her hand. It was striking. The band loved it. Their manager loved it. The guy on the label who'd signed them loved it. But the press department didn't like it and said, no, you can't release that as a cover.
Right.
We want a picture of the band on the cover. Yeah. So Conor Horgan, again, the photographer, and I said, what's the most recognise a picture of a band we can take that is a picture of the band on the cover, and that's what we took. And we presented them, and they didn't know what to say, that this was the record cover, because all is out of shape focuses with movement. But again, the band talked to management to say, yeah, we like it. And I tried to the idea of emotional and the whole thing, I tried to create a typographical logo that looked interesting in what they did. And then the F for fish looked like a fish jumping out of water. And there's actually 2 versions. There's another version where the logo is at the top corner, and this is I think this might be the CD version, and the other one might have been the vinyl version of it. But it was a great. We spent a week with the band when they were recording in an old water mill in London, or outside of London in the studio, and we stayed with them, played football in the evenings, went touring around for houses that were abandoned, and we took a week's worth of photographs, because when you're doing an album cover, you're not simply photographing that particular piece, you're photographing all the press photographs, all the tour program photographs, all the photos that are going to be used for a campaign that might last, and all the immediate single covers will come from that session.
And I presume you want some sort of continuity within that.
You do. You
at
want
least just at that first out. That,
absolutely.
You know,
You're kind of working with the same logo in some ways and doing versions of that. So there has to be a continuity to it.
And again, because even on your next one, again, because it's what I like with this is that they're not all off the band, or so some of the covers have no connection directly with the band.
Because it is the band.
Yeah,
it's the emotion.
It is, exactly.
That's Jerry Fish.
Yeah,
he's old
exactly,
Mr. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's really kind of doing it.
Yeah.
And Connor's press photographs at Emotional Fish, and again, this is not album covers, but some of his photographs are brilliant because Jerry's not the main focus on the band. It's somebody else in the band.
Yeah.
Dave or somebody is the key part of the element. And some of the guys are either blurry or they got their heads turned.
Yeah.
That is what a band is. It's a kind of bunch of people to get together. They create this unit, and it just works as an element.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, what you're doing is you're literally just capturing them in a moment anyway.
Absolutely, and that's a cornfield.
Yeah,
that was them trampling in the middle of a cornfield. And it's working that way.
So then this one.
Yes.
That's not the band, but it is the band, obviously, in a way, But this is Whipping Boy, obviously, But so what's the notion or the
notion there? This is a photographer I worked with called Brendan Fitzpatrick, and I genuinely think Brendan was a genius. He was a pre-computer photographer, and a lot of the pictures he took were multiple exposures, things like that. And he and I would work very closely together. We would sit for a long time, often not with the band, because the band was kind of a strange unit. They often disagreed entirely on what they wanted to do with the cover. But the idea of the heart-shaped mirror and how Heartworm would almost destroy you was something. And we Brendan asked a friend of his to stand in for the pictures, and it's out of focus. It's kind of like, but the cracked mirror it summed up that band, because they fractured fairly soon after that. Anyway, they released one more album, but they were never really, their moment had gone, and yet this is a classic Irish album. It is one of the major.
Oh, I know, because you could see the reaction when it was re-released a couple of years ago.
It was absolutely brilliant to do it. Unfortunately, the record company they didn't redo the artwork, but they simply repackaged it. I would have liked to have expanded on what we had, because I had a lot of outtakes. In fact, do you remember there was a free print of a kind of face? That was Brendan again. We got a rubber mask, and we turned it into the light to take a face and do something different with it. And the distortion of the image, because none of the guys in the band wanted to be on the cover. And that was great, because it just gave you the freedom to do that. And that again is the listening to the music and saying, how can we express that title? How can we express the band? And what I loved about it was I would sit there with Brendan, and he would go away, and he would come back with something better than we had discussed. And I said, wow, this is, and that's what I love, working with people who take an idea and take it further. So that it's not just me, it's the two of us working together that creates that cover.
And I think you're right, it does, like, that does capture, as you said, it captures the band themselves, what they were like, but it reflects the music perfectly as well.
Absolutely, and that is one of my favourite covers. It really worked really well. And that amount of time afterwards, for it to still have that resonance. And again, I was saying, it isn't like tied to a particular era. It's a strong image in itself.
It's lovely, And now your next one is a really interesting. It's very well. We take a look at it, and we talk about this one, because there's lots and lots in this.
Yes, there is. Henry McCullough, a wonderful man, a great guitar player. There's a story as well. When my band were recording an album called Sound City Beat, which was our tribute to the beat groups of the 60s, Henry was in a band called Sweeney's Men for a time, but that actually never recorded. And Terry Woods, who was later in the Pogues and the Sweeney's Men, was in the band. So we thought, wouldn't it be great to get them down on a track that is contemporary to them and their era, and to come down to the studio and play together on the same track. So we rang up Henry. This was after this. I'll go back to the cover now. And Henry said he'd come down. We paid for a hotel. We put him up in the hotel. Now, Henry's not the most technical person in the world. We were wondering where the hell we were in the studio, waiting to do it, and he hadn't turned up. And I said, He doesn't have a mobile phone. How are we going to contact him? And in the most coincidental, I don't know how to describe zeitgeist moment, I got a call from Billy Morley, who was our original guitar player. He said he was walking down the street that runs behind Abbey Street when this guy with long hair walked up to him and said, "Do you know the Radiators?" And this is totally random. And he said, yes. He said, "I'm supposed to be in the studio with them." So Billy rang me and said, "I've got Henry McCullough here." Now, he could have asked 100 people and they wouldn't know what the hell he was talking about. And Henry came in the studio.
Maybe he had the look, maybe he was using your...
Billy had the look. Billy looked like Mick Ronson. He had the look, so he'd asked him the whole thing. And I went down and met them and brought him up to the studio. And it amazed me that Henry sat there. We played him the track on the 2 speakers, and he just sat there and listened. He said, "Okay, ready to go." And like that famous story about him playing the solo on Wings, he just went, and it was absolutely brilliant. It was just exactly what the track needed. I said, "Thank you very much, I'm going back to Belfast." But he was a lovely gentleman. When this was a friend of mine who was also a member of the Troy Pilgrims for a while, Paddy Goodwin, wanted to... He paid for this album to happen, and he wanted Henry to come down. He wanted to play on it with Henry and the whole thing, and it was called Poor Man's Moon. Henry had written a lot of songs with Eamon Carr from Horselips, and it was a kind of a roots album. There was elements of blues, elements of country, elements of other things in there, and elements of rock in it. And I brought Henry down to the studio, and I said, "Henry, look, he was not very comfortable having his picture taken." The whole thing. So I sat him in the studio, brought in a little amp, and said, "Henry, just play, be what you are, be what you could do." And the photographer Ronnie Norton, who I worked with a lot as well, just took pictures of Henry as he was playing and he was doodling, and it was wonderful to listen to this guy playing the guitar, And I wanted the logo to reflect that sort of it's old wood typography that I was using, that goes back to the 20s and 30s and 40s. Yeah. But I just thought the balance of the guitar and Henry's face and the whole thing really worked well.
Yeah, and again, it's a lovely piece because I think it's hard to get a grip on you, to be quite honest, because, as you say, I suppose in a way you're looking at this. These are all gigs, these are jobs, so it doesn't matter who the client is. No. You just want to do the best for the client. That's it.
Yeah, you just need to know where his music's coming from and what he wants to do. And he loved the cover. And in fact, there's a wonderful T-shirt with just the Henry McCullough and Poor Man's Moon on it, and everybody loved it, loved the whole thing. And that for him, it was something he could utilise afterwards and post was great for me. And of course, unfortunately, Henry didn't last too long after that. But I'm again proud of that. I just enjoyed the experience, and we walked around Dublin together because we didn't just photograph in the studio. There's a picture on the back cover. I'm walking along carrying the guitar case. We just walked around the canals and things like that. He just chatted to me as we walked, and I'd say, "Stop there, let me get out of the picture and let you just do this." And he was so relaxed in that, for something that he never was in front of the camera for the most part. And that's an art of getting a good picture out of an art, is let them relax in front of the camera. Because if I remember doing a session with a band, and they were signed to an English label, and they had a certain look themselves. And for the first session, they had a stylist, and the stylist was taking all these brand new shirts out of a package. And the guys looked and saying, "Geez, that's horrible, and want to wear that." And the session was dreadful because they were not relaxed
just weren't
at all, and they didn't like the clothes, and it didn't really work. So what became a thing that people realised later on, even with U2, was that the stylist would give them the clothes 3 or 4 days ahead of the session and said, "Wear them, put them on, relax in them."
Yeah, don't even think about them. Just
and until it became something that this is something that I like to do, and do it that way.
And I suppose, you've got a couple. I suppose we'd bring up the first one that has a kind of Galway connection as well. That's not an album cover as such, but
No, I wanted. This was an example of. I think Mary was not signed to Warner's at this point. She was signed to Janice Desmond's label. I think it was Solid or one of those labels. Anyway, it was basically they came to me. We have no budget. So it's got to be printed 2 colours at the maximum.
Yeah.
So I think Frank Miller, who was Mary's boyfriend at the time, took this picture. I thought, again, I looked at the picture and said, wow, this is, it looks like a person who's just looking at the rain and the whole thing. And I found this texture in the background. It looked like rain falling down. Yeah. And I picked the 2 typefaces that I felt really reflected. But I think banding the picture gave it this kind of emotion. Mm-hmm. And Mary, as you know, is a wonderful singer. Yeah. She was really good fun to work with. And I did a couple more covers with her. But
So sorry, and I just even because this was just a single. I don't mean just a single.
Well, it was a 7-inch and a 12-inch.
Yeah, it was important, I think, for her, wasn't it?
Yes, it was
calling.
I think it might have been her first.
Yeah.
Actual release, and it came out in a 7-inch version and a 3-track 12-inch.
Because the 12-inch, the B-side is live stuff.
Yeah, you know? But it was good. I mean, and she's such a ribald humour, you know. And she would tell me very, very quickly if she didn't like something. Yeah. She'd say, would you F off on that? I'm not going to put that in the cover. You know?
And again, like, did you have that? Like, so you were given the image, or did she have a range of images already?
Yeah, no, I spoke to Frank and said, well, let's look at what some images
you've got.
And I just felt this one is the one to use, you know. Because, I mean, people find it very odd. I learned to scan a contact sheet very quickly. Right. Because quite often you'd working away and I'd look very quick. And I'd always go to the first contact sheet that I got from a photo session. I would mark maybe 5 or 6 shots very, very quickly, and then I get a print done and look at it more closely. And things like that. But I would know from the eye that's the shot I'm looking for. Now, it could be, you might blow it up and find the eyes were closed or whatever, and you'd look for a... But in those days, there was no Photoshop. There was no changing. I mean, later years you'd be changing heads and moving things, bodies, parts around,
removing band members.
Yeah, to get one shot. And it reminded me of Russian history, where somebody would be in favour and they'd be in a picture in a book. Next time round, that picture would be gone. Where the hell is the guy gone from? So this was a straightforward one shot and the whole thing. But I just thought, because of the connection, what we're doing here today, to show some of these artists that came from this locality, and in fact, later on, the Donegal artist, the Revs, which is another one of my favourite covers, so we'll get to in
I think right the next, with essentially right next door is this one, you know. So
this is it.
It's 2 parts,
To show people, basically, I went up to Donegal. Yeah. Loved the band. The band and I spent.
Rory Gallagher,
the other one, another one, and the guitarist.
Yeah.
I think he changed his name, but anyway. And we talked about doing something that was self-destruct as a cover.
Right.
And I found a printer who was not necessarily a record sleeve printer, but a printer who could do this hand-binded cover. So when you go to the next slide, you can see the card is really thick, heavy card. And the sleeve is stamped and embossed into the cover.
Right.
So I knew that this would start to wear, and you can see copies in second-hand shops of it, where it's completely different, because each one is worn in a different way. And I love that sense of it. And it's actually the drum kit, and that's why I showed the cover of the actual booklet, is the oar on the drum kit, and the whole thing.
So the reverse there,
and the hand letter Revs.
And is that like a cloth bind?
It's a cloth. It's cloth. This guy used to print books, poetry books, and things like that. So he never, and the only problem he had was the CD itself was supposed to go into a black sleeve. Yeah. But in fact, he only could get was white covers inside. Yeah. But the booklet is great. That's photographer Christy McNamara, who's from Clare, and Christy only photographs on film. He never uses digital camera. Okay. So, and again, we spent 3 days up in Donegal with them, which was a great time driving around, just stopping to find any place you know in there that you'd like to photograph. And we did a lot of photography to do it. And what kind of saddened me was that they broke up. Yep. They had a huge falling out with one of the men, and the girl who got us to do that was kind of more or less let go by the band, and then the whole thing never got the publicity or the backing that it should have got on the album, and eventually the band just gave up on it, which is a shame, because it's still a cover I get out and say, it looks great, it's lasted well.
But I suppose that's the music thing. You just don't know. You know, you don't know. You don't know that. Like you two didn't know that they had 40 years in them or whatever.
A lot of bands I work with don't exist anymore. You know, and it's a shame that they never got the breaks. Like Light a Big Fire. Yeah. I mean, Light a Big Fire just the album, the third album, never released. Yeah. You know, it was just a shame. You know, but that's the nature of bands as well.
And then we've this.
This
Which
I've chosen because
yeah.
this was done in Ardmore Studios.
Right.
And I had worked with Elvis Costello on a number of covers. But I'd never really, in my life, listened to string quartets in a long way. So what we did here was Amelia and I, Amelia's worked for theatre companies and for the Wexford Opera and had been working with set designers for the opera and things like that. So we decided down in Ardmore to build this set with the wall and the floor and the roses and the whole thing. And I went down to Ardmore for 3 days in a row. And I became from, what is this strange music that I've never heard before, to actually understanding it exactly what fits Elvis Costello's writing.
Yeah.
And I began to really love what I was hearing and broaden my own musical outlooks to do the whole thing. So we shot a lot of shots for this and individual shots, and we shot stuff that was going to be used for the publicity as well as everything else.
Because I presume again, because the sleeve booklet, there's lots of fake.
Absolutely, yeah. There's lots of outtakes.
One I like is that the back cover is essentially the same image, but they're looser.
Yes.
You know, they're slightly out of focus, or they're laughing.
Yeah,
it's the same.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing, having the camera there for 3 days. And eventually people are kind of slightly stiff on the first day. Yeah. And eventually they begin to realise the camera isn't there. Yeah. Which brings us to another question. I mean, people often say to me, they talk about great photography books that came out, and two that stand to mind are Penny Smith's Clash portfolio and Annie Leavitt's Rolling Stones portfolio. And nowadays, if a photographer is doing live photography, they're kind of given 3 numbers to photograph. Yeah. I think, and it's totally, you just can't get it. So what happened with Annie Leavitt, and she was there so much that she became invisible. Just this person with a camera. She was in the dressing room or on the stage or in the corner. So they began to take pictures. They began to get pictures that were really what the live experience was.
Really candid as well.
Yeah. I remember, I think it was Metallica recently saying that this is not a rule that more than likely the bands have invented. It's a management thing, the free photography. He said the initial idea was, the first 3 are going to be not sweaty or whatever, but the real excitement is in the final
later.
3. And Metallica said that's what we've asked for to be photographed. The final 3 shots where we're really sweaty and we're really enjoying the gig. And it still happens. I mean, it's so insidious these days. I've been to shows where we've been asked to do photographs, and you're asked to take the photographs from the mixing desk. Yeah. You're not even getting close. Yeah. And I said, we just don't do it. What's the point of doing that if you're not going to give the photographer access? When every single person in the audience has the camera and is filming right up close. Yeah. And it's kind of like they don't want to give the professional photographer anything to use as a whole thing. But now you look at the U2 calendars from done by fans, or for they're legitimate companies, but they're not paying any royalties. Yeah. And they're all live photographs taken with cheap cameras. The band will say, well, where did these crappy photographs come? It's because you didn't let the photographer do the thing. Yeah. Now, in U2's case, they work very closely with people like Anton Corbijn, and Anton is given access if he's doing. But Anton and I did a Depeche Mode cover. And he didn't say it to me, but he said, I've got to do this album cover for a release called Live in Berlin. And he didn't say all I've got is camera phone photos, but I think he didn't arrange a proper photographic session. Yeah. So he said he just gave me his phone shots, but they in themselves had a texture that was actually quite interesting. Yeah. And they actually became quite interesting to work with because they were quite sort of grainy and out of focus, but they created
and they worked, I suppose,
in a different context. But normally he would go and take proper, high-res photography for a live show and do it that way.
So, I mean, is it important, I think, still, I mean, you're probably not doing it as much, but was this important to have that time, to have whatever time, I'm not an unending amount of time, but just time to sit with the band or time to sit with the artists or time to just hang out with them or...
Yeah, and that's very true. Yeah. And a lot of the sleeves that didn't work was because you had a very tight budget, and quite often you were halfway through a sleeve and you were saying to the record company, it's not right, it's not working. And they would say, well, we have no more budget and the album has to be out next week. So on the pure practical side, you had to get paid because you had to pay your staff and you had to pay the office and you had to pay everything else. So you finished the sleeve because as best you could. I mean, I had one particular sleeve, I remember, I used a photograph that I'd taken myself in a barber shop in New York that the band really liked. And the person in the record company said, I don't like it. And I said, well, what is it you don't like? And I said, I don't know. So I eventually cornered her and say, look, I can't progress this unless you give me some clue as what it is you object to. And she said, well, I had a kitchen painted that colour before and I never liked it. I said, now I know what the problem is. We can change the colour. You know what I mean? But just to say no because you didn't like that it's getting that information that makes it, you can take it to the next level by having that information to do it. You know?
Right, we've got just a couple left to go, but this is again brings us back to Galway. You know?
Yeah. So this is again this guy that I absolutely love, Brendan Fitzpatrick.
Yeah.
This was a personal shot that Brendan had done. And it was a pair of old boots, obviously. And he used to go around picking up, if you find dead animals on the street, and he put them in as part of them into the picture. And I love the fact it's like almost like Mercury's flying boots. Yeah. And I just thought, if you're going to walk on a tightrope, you need boots with wings to do it. Yeah. And it's actually the only cover I think I did for the Stunning. Because they had their own designer. I think that the record label wanted this to come out fairly quickly. But and they actually made T-shirts of it. Yeah. But I liked the typography, which was kind of like almost a version of circus lettering with the whole thing. But I think the picture's amazing. I think it's really, really good.
And was like, how quickly did that come together?
Very. That happened within 2 or 3 days. Because there was a demand to get out very quickly. So I had to go looking for imagery. Yeah. And I just immediately found this. Brendan and I just looked and I said, that's brilliant, Brendan. Let's present that to them. And we did. And it went through very quickly. And I actually don't remember if the band actually even... They must have approved it along the way. Point, I certainly didn't have any real conversation with them about it. You know, I just said, well, you know, this is what we've come up with to do it.
Great. Okay. Well, we're nearly wrapping it up. So this is kind of tying it back to the start, you know. So
this was an album we released. It was the first album that we released after we reformed the Radiators. Yeah. And Philip was insistent that we would. If we were going to reform as a band, we weren't just going to play old songs all the time. We were going to release new albums and new material. So Pete and Philip set about writing new songs for this album. So the version on the top right was the first version of it for the Irish market. And at the time, somebody said, oh, great logo. Look at the bands like Franz Ferdinand with just the Franz Ferdinand across the cover. So... The title of the album was Trouble Pilgrim, and the name that comes from a book I was reading, and in it there was it wasn't about John Wayne, but there was the guy was talking about a passage in a film that he'd seen with John Wayne, and he said John Wayne is riding down the trail, and there's this beat up guy at the side of the road, and he stops his horse and says, "Trouble Pilgrim," and I just thought it's a great name for an album, Trouble Pilgrim, you know. So and then unfortunately. After we did the next album, Philip Sherburne he had his cancer, which eventually killed him in the end. So we had agreed with him before he passed away that he was so essential to the Radiators that we wouldn't use the name Radiators unless we got permission from his sister or something. But we said, let's be seen as a new band. So we called the band Trouble Pilgrims. And that's where we're still recording and playing under the name Trouble Pilgrims. In fact, I did 2 gigs at the Forest Fest yesterday, playing live. That's what my voice is from singing and doing the whole thing is a bit. But anyway, that was Johnny, the drummer, and that was taken in the rehearsal room. He was due to have a hernia operation the next day. I said, "You look like a troubled pilgrim. Let's take this picture and do it." Then Chiswick Records decided they liked the record so much they'd release it in the UK, and this was at the time of the whole Abu Ghraib situation that was happening in Iraq and things like that. And in fact, although you can't really see it on this particular version of it, behind the Raiders and Trouble Pilgrim in the white panel is the Irish Constitution and the American Constitution about welcoming people to come and live here and do the whole thing. So, funnily enough, a guy who owned an art gallery in London, who was a friend of the record label boss, said that's one of the strongest images I've seen. Of that. Now, that image is a world now, but what I did was, I didn't want to use the image exactly as it was, so I actually did a split, so the hand is the same hand repeated on both sides. And the eyes that you can see, you can't really see very well, but the eyes are actually the light of the torch of the Statue of Liberty. And I just wanted to make that point that all of us, all countries are welcoming in there and things. But then, as we know now, we now have an immigration situation that's so difficult for every country in the world. You don't know how it's going to be resolved. So then this version here on the top left, that was the American label version that was licensed for America. And this is the picture that Philip Chevron wanted to use on the album cover from the very, very beginning. He had got a DVD of a show that came out in America in the 50s called Dark, Dark Hours. And that was an episode that featured Ronald Reagan as a doctor.
Right.
And what's his name? Just gone in my head for a second. The famous picture walking in Times Square, the actor.
James Dean.
James Dean, sorry, it went on in my head. And James Dean bursts into the doctor's surgery, carrying a guy on his arm, and they'd just done a bank robbery, and the guy's been shot, and he holds the gun, and Ronald Reagan says, you fix it, or I'm going to shoot you, and the whole thing. And Philip thought, this is like the punk and the establishment, let's see if we can do it. And I got in touch with, I think his name was Dennis Stockwell, he was the photographer who took that. He was a big friend of.
Oh yeah, Dean Stockwell.
Dean Stockwell. He was a friend of James Dean's, and I got in touch and I actually spoke to him, and it was really funny. He said to me, "I can license and be happy to license you the picture for the cover of the album, but he said, I'm telling you right now, the James Dean Foundation will ask you for $500,000 to use any image of James Dean. They want to control it completely." So I said, okay, we can't use it. And then I came to the American release, and this was a tiny American label that said, we want to release it, and we don't care, because we don't have the money. What's the point of suing us? So we don't have any money. So the whole thing. So I said, okay, to change the perspective on it, I took a picture of the television screen.
Right.
Which is my picture.
So it's not the image. It's your picture.
It's my picture. So that's what we used on the American cover. And then, as I say, the Japanese changed it. They said, we want it to be the zigzag lettering. So, and I just changed the tone of it to the blue and did it. So that's 4 versions of the same cover in different territories, which is me all over. If I could change the cover, every cover I did to different covers for different territories, I would love it. I just like to move on and just do some different. So just use just 4 different options from the same idea initially, or the same title to work with. Well, I'm the boss. So
that's right. You're the boss. You can fire them. So that gets us to the end. This has been fascinating. I have 2 really unfair questions for you.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Right. Who would you love to do?
Who would I love to do?
Who would you love to do? Or alive or dead? Why not? Go for it.
There's probably so many acts that I would love to have work. I would like to have work with the Pogues. Because Philip tried to get me to the Pogues, but he said, if you know anything about the Pogues, he said, you can't win. It's a constant argument about everything. So let them do their own thing, But I would like to have them on a Pogue sleeve. And I think there's, I was scheduled to work on a Robert Plant cover.
Right.
And he rang me up out of the blue and said, I love your work. I'd like you to do a cover for me. And I had spoken to Anton. I said, we can do a great shot of Robert for the cover. And then the record company decided they also changed the title. I think it's the cover with the world on it sort of melting or whatever. Well, I can't remember the exact title, but that's what it became. But and I had met Robert beforehand, and I had met him later on in life. And I talked to him about it.
You took a photograph of him in 1971
exactly,
in the National Stadium.
National Stadium, Well, I didn't have I did have a camera, but that was the story. It's in a book about John Bonham. I was sitting behind the story was, I don't know if you want to hear the story, but it was, I'd gone along to National Stadium, knocked on the door and said, I'm here to interview Led Zeppelin. I wasn't writing for any magazine, or I was potentially just doing it for a school magazine or whatever. But I knocked on the door and said, I want to hear the interview. In those days, some broken-nosed boxer would say, down the back, So I wandered down the back. And the only person in the dressing rooms was John Bonham. And I said, I'm here to do an interview. And he said, yeah, fine, I'll talk, but I don't want to talk about music. Right. Let's just talk. And you think this guy is the rock god, but as I realized afterwards, he's only about a year and a half older than I am. So we had common ground. I used to love hot rods. And a guy called Big Ed Eddie Roth used to do these wonderful hot rod cartoons and drawings. And he was a hot rod fanatic. So we spoke for over an hour and a bit more. Just about things in general. And I was writing notes and taking things. And I said, I really appreciate the time you give me, but I have to go. The gig is sold out, and I don't have a ticket. She said, that's okay. I'll bring you up the stage. Come and sit behind me on the drum kit. I'm sitting behind him. So I had a camera which had no flash, a really cheap camera, and I said I have to wait every time the light comes around to take a picture. And I took about 5 pictures. Yeah. But in fact, this guy who wrote the book about John Bonham had heard about it, and he said, "Can I use some of the pictures you've taken?" So if you buy that book, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's available in all my bookshops. You'll see the 4 pictures taken from behind the stage.
Because I remember on the front of the stage there was always a Guinness sign hanging behind the band.
Yes, somebody had taken a colour picture for one of the evening hours.
No matter who they were, there was a big Guinness sign.
Yeah, with the big Guinness sign. So after the gig, he got me to walk with him, and I sat in the dressing room, and it suddenly became very aware. There was Peter Grant, who was an ominous big figure, the 4 members of Led Zeppelin, and me. And I think, what am I doing here? And then Robert Plant comes over and says, "Do you want to go to a nightclub with us?" And I said, "No, I've got school tomorrow." And I knew I had to get home to the suburbs. And if I didn't make the connections, I wouldn't get home. The last bus. And I heard a postscript to that story, and it was a friend of mine who I met years later was working in Jury's coffee dock as a tea boy or coffee boy. And he said they suddenly realised after an hour there was no nightclubs in Dublin. There was nowhere they could go. There was no Pink Elephant or any of these places. So the only place that was open was the coffee dock. So they went there to get coffee and things like that. And he was told by the manager they were making a lot of noise. He said, "Go over and tell those people to be quiet." And he knew who they were, but the manager didn't. So he went over and says, "My manager has said, would you mind keeping it quiet?" And a roaring Peter Grant says, opens this suitcase, which is crammed full of money. And he says, "I'm going to buy this hotel and I'm going to fire you." And he just in the background, go ahead and do it. But it just shows Dublin was not a nightlife town in those days. And the gig was great. The gig was like literally 3 hours long, And it was broken in the middle by John Bonham's half-an-hour drum solo, which was like, which people don't do now. But if you go back to those days, people did do drum solos. I saw Ginger Baker doing drum solo. I saw other people, literally a half-hour drum solo, and he was down to playing it with his hands, and it was actually, fascinating to watch somebody do it. But great gig anyway. But that's my life in 12 sleeves. Great. And if I do it again, what I'm saying is I pick different sleeves as much as possible each time, because every one of the sleeves has a story. So, I hope that was enlightening or enjoying or whatever, but I'm quite happy to take questions if anybody has a question they'd like to ask.
How did you feel about the change?
Yeah, sorry. Can we bring up the lights as well, Oisin, maybe just, thanks.
1, 2, hello. Hi Steve, my name is Jamie Hart. I'm actually ex-pupil of Pete Holiday's.
Okay, good. There's many of them.
Yeah, we're still in touch. I just would like to ask you a question about the change between vinyl and tapes, because it was different. The shape was different.
I mean, people forget that as well. Vinyl was the initial format, and then cassettes came in. And cassettes were a whole different ball game, because they were a different shape, a different way of working with them, and there are some, and then there's not only did we have that to deal with, but we also then for a while had mini discs, and we also had the little thin tape that they were kind of even smaller than cassettes, so you have to try and give as much as you could. So sometimes, especially with say a U2 album, the cassette was like. It went on forever, and it was very difficult to get back into the cover once you did it. But by and large, you didn't have the capacity to do an awful lot with it. So you tried to adapt the cover. So generally speaking, the image was maybe 2/3 of the cover, and the title was a little. I liked cassettes. I think they were really interesting. But you just adapted to the shape to do it. And occasionally, when I was let, I tried to design like the initial, say, Joshua Tree cover. Has a very different picture on the cassette because it fitted the upright shape. So I would always, and in vinyl was the same. Vinyl and CD, if you were doing the two together, you would try and move the type around, because the type on a vinyl cover is much bigger than the type on a CD cover. So you might have to make the type on a CD cover positioned differently and work that way. But whatever there was even laser discs as well. So there was times when we had 8 different formats, because if you were designing an album specifically for U2, it was for the world. So you might have up to 15 different formats that you have to accommodate the design onto. So it's quite tricky, you know, to get everything that, and make it sort of comprehensive and seem like it came from the same family.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have one here and then up the back.
Hi Steve, thanks very much for that great chat. Just wanted to ask you about copyright. You mentioned it on the album cover up there on the top left. How much does copyright stop potential designs that you might have?
It is quite difficult. Copyright has always been an issue, because obviously you get bootlegs and you get all sorts of things coming out. It was an issue for me, especially with the bands who were signed to major labels, because what they started to do was the copyright for a long time. Again, we take U2 as they're the biggest band. In their case, the copyright was owned by the band and the management, and to a degree by myself. And then the record companies came along and said, no, you can't do that. We can't police this worldwide unless we own the copyright. So suddenly the copyright's been moved in the artwork, not so much in the music. The band were able to retain their own copyright. So suddenly I'd find myself not owning the copyright for my own. And then the law changed, and the law said the designer must have copyright licensing. But the bands, the record companies would get over that by saying, well, if you want this job, you've got to sign your rights away. So the only way you could carry on doing design was signing your rights away. So it's a very tricky situation. But the other area of copyright that I am very aware and talk to bands about now is the licensing of an image. And I would lecture on this and say, if you're in a band and you do a deal, you want photographs done for your band, you need to talk to the photographer at that session, and explain to him, because what they'll say to you is, for this fee you can have 6 photographs, but you don't own the rights to the photographs. So I know of bands that have been sued when they put the image on a T-shirt because they don't own the rights to it. So as regards copyright, it's always good to find out where the copyright belongs. And if you have a photographer you're working with, just say to the photographer, look, we want to own these for the use on this for an album cover, for a poster, for advertising, for things. And once it's clear in the very beginning that that's what you're doing, it's fine to do it. But if you go ahead and do it without... Now, copyright these days is much more insidious, because most of these people who do copyright are libraries that are online. They're able to detect their image being used. You know, so if you see a picture of a landscape that you like and say that'll make a great album cover, and you use it without clearance, chances are you'll get sued. But of course, what we talked about there is, with our album cover, if you're nobody, then nobody's going to sue you for nothing. I did a cover for Clan at one time, and one of the band said they wanted the cover to be an illustration of a member of the band in the MC Escher, you know, the unraveling head. And we got a new artist to do it, and it was clear that it wasn't MC Escher, and everybody approved it. But when the album was released in Germany, they were sued by a guy who had a license for MC Escher's work in Germany. And it was a really fraught moment for me, because they came back to me and said, oh, you did it, so therefore you're liable for, you know, whatever lawsuit is there. But when I went to court in Germany, the guy said to them, how much is a license for an MC Escher illustration? 250. That's all you're entitled to. So they thought we're in for millions or whatever, but it wasn't. I also had a case where, this is a T-shirt case, where a guy claimed that he owned the rights to Celtic art, because he'd done a badge, and the Hot House Flowers had a Celtic symbol on the whole thing. And he tried to sort of say, well, I'm going to sue you. That again was thrown out, because that's, you know, it's ancient, and everybody's, it's not the only example of art. Which, all I'm saying is, copyright is an area that's very fraught with it. I once went to a seminar where they talked about the ancient art of collage, where people actually sort of cut images together and made a picture out of things. Under current law, you would really supposed to get a license for every single piece that you do it. But people don't. People just go ahead and do it. But it is always a grey area that people could stop you using an image. Like I did a Radiators for the Radiators album, second album. there's an image. We did it. They asked me to do a series of press ads for each track on the album, and for Song of the Faithful Departed, I did a rip-off of The Exorcist. And you know where there's the guy with the suitcase, and I had a picture of Philip Chevron there. So it wasn't the same thing, but we got a cease and desist letter from the film company, and it's fine because you're only going to use the advert once, but if you use it again, you would be in serious trouble. And I made the title type exactly the same type as The Exorcist. so I'm guilty of doing it. I mean, when I first started in advertising, somebody told me that all you had to do was turn a picture from left to right to change the copyright. But I soon learned that's not true.
We'll take one final question there at the back here.
Hi, Steve. I was just wondering how you came about using the same boy on the cover of U2's War album as you did on the cover of the Boy album, and what the process was for that, because it wasn't.
Yeah, that came about by when the title of War came up, and we were talking about it. We made contact with people like Donald McCullin. I don't know if you know Donald McCullin. He's a well-known war photographer who's photographed pictures in all sorts of war conflict zones around the world. And there was a number, and even in Belfast, we looked at pictures of conflict. And I said, it's too specific. You're actually identifying one place. And that's not what the title, or the meaning of the title was about. It was about a much bigger picture of war. So I went to the band and I said, look, I have a vivid memory of watching a newsreel footage taken in the Second World War of children in the Jewish ghetto being rounded up by Nazi soldiers, and the children are all terrified. And I said, there's one child with his hands like that, and you can see it, the fear in his face. So I said, that is the fear of war in the eyes, not in a specific picture. So I said, we should try and do that. So we thought about, shall we get somebody else, shall we get another kid? But we felt that Peter's face and image was so specific, and they didn't feel there was any conflict with it being on the Boy album cover. So we decided to re-photograph it for the War cover. So again, the photographer on that cover was not Hugo McGuinness, but Ian Finlay, who I worked with quite a bit in the advertising world. And we got Peter into the studio, and we did a number of shots. We used some with a helmet, some with a gas mask and things like that, some with a white flag that were all used in different processes. So in those days, it wasn't digital, so Ian would take a picture and he would have a Polaroid, and we'd look at the Polaroid, and I'd say, it's not right. There's something wrong with this picture, that it's too specific to the first album cover. It's got a white background. It just doesn't work for me. So I really didn't know where we were going with this, so I went out for a walk to clear my head. And I went out and I saw that Ian had a wood bunker, and the top of the wood bunker was a piece of corrugated metal that was gone and rusted. So I picked this up and I walked in and said, this is the background. So if you saw a wider picture of the album cover, you'd see me standing behind him holding up this piece of corrugated, because the corrosion was what I was looking for in that picture. And also, the weird thing was, Peter had a small cut on his lip. And when we printed it, that came more prominent by the contrast in the picture, to the point where people asked me, did we actually punch him in the face to get that? I said, no, we paid him Mars bars, But it's, to me, even though it is in many ways a repeat of the same cover, it's a different strength and a different meaning. So I felt it worked very well in the cover, and they were delighted. And that again became the biggest selling U2 poster print that we did for many years. We made it as a special limited edition print, and it was really, really successful.
Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies
Thank
and
you all
gentlemen,
for
please thank Steve Averill. Thank you. There you go.